E honore he karoia ki te atua, he maunga rongo hoki ki te mato te whenua, he whakaro pai ki ngā tangata katoa. Ko te tuatahi, he mihi mai o hā, he mihi kauana ki a koutou, te whānau mai Kawerau, ki a koe tā kuta Pitaruha, kōrua tahi ko Kelly Johnson, mo te kaha o kōrua mahi. Kia koutou katoa e mahi ana tēnei kaupapa whakahirehira, kei roto i tēnei kaupapa whakahirehira, ka ati te whakamomori, te hauora, te mauriora o te katoa o ngā whānau. He mihi aroha tēnei hoki, kia kōrua ngā māma e tautoko ana o tamaiti. Kei roto i tēnei mahi. Kei a kōrua te kōrero. Kia ora rā.
I te tuatahi ka tukitake mihi kia koe e kiri nā tō kupu aroha i whārikihia ki te whakatau tō tātou nei kaupapa i tēnei wā anō reira he mihi kauana tēnei kia koe. Ki nā whānau e mātakitaki ana tēnei o tātou nei kōrero ara he kōrero e pāna ki te hāpori o Kawerau, he mihi kauana tēnei kia koutou katoa. Hoi anō rā, lohia wēnei waiwai, taho tōku māma te hapuka te patu ai, mai te manuka tūtahi ki whakatāne o nā te awa. Ka huri taka kāno hiki te taho tōku pāpā, te whānau nā riki hana, te hapu ko tūhaurangi, ara he mokopuna tēnei no te wako o te aroa. Hoi anō rā, he mihi kauana tēnei, kia tātou i raro i te taumahatanga o tēnei kaupapa ara ko te whakamomori tira. Anei he kaupapa whānau, he kaupapa aroha. Anō reira, tēnā tātou katoa. Kia ora.
Mōrena koutou, ko Kelly Johnson's tōku I live in Kawerau and born and raised in Kawerau as well. And I hail from Ngāti Tūwhareto, te Whakatōhea, Ngāti Kahununu, te whānau a Ehutu, te whānau a Apunui and Tapuika. Kia ora.
Kia ora koe. One of the first things I'd like to do is just acknowledge Kapua Te Ua, who was our tohunga, our cultural advisor, our kaumātua for this piece of work that we undertook back in 2011. At the time, we mobilised our whānau champion kaupapa. Our community was in a crisis. Our hauora was in a space where no one really wanted to tautoko. So kapua come at a time when we didn't have a lot of tautoko on board. It come at a time when things were really challenging and tough in terms of addressing the issues that needed to be attended to in our community. And so this is a dedication to kapua who's no longer with us. And we were fortunate enough to have him gift the name Ngā Tō Te Whānau Champions in terms of acknowledging the aroha that was driving this entire kaupapa so that we didn't lose another loved one to suicide. So tēnā koe te rangati rei te tohunga e kapua moi mai rā. Kia ora koe. Kawerau is a community that's made up of several services and providers. It's a population of 6,000. At the time, I returned home from living away from home, so I got the call from my mama, me hoki mai koe, ki te kāinga, I had 7 nephews addicted to methamphetamine at the time, so that was really the call to come home. When I come home to Kawerau, born and raised in Kawerau, left when I was 15 to go and do my schooling. The dream was always to come back and give back to my community. And so I was tools down and returned home. And returning home, I was fortunate enough to secure mahi at Tūwharetua Kawerau Hauora as the clinical lead. At the time that I returned home and started at the Hauora, we had a spate of suicides occurring in our community. At the time, there was about 13. Alongside of that, there were a whole lot of other issues that were moving through our community. And so I was a little bit anxious about returning home and doing the mahi that needed to be done. And so I also just want to take the opportunity to acknowledge the many hands that come on board alongside of kapua when things were really challenging for us. That's Emma Kutia from Kia Piki Te Ora, our Te Kupinga whānau, our bereaved whānau to suicide. And it was actually our bereaved whānau to suicide who called in Honourable Tariana Turia to clear the way for us. We had so much going on in our community in terms of community politics that we actually needed help. We needed help as a community, and Tariana come into the community and she cleared the way for us. Apologies for the background noise. We've just got some of our whānau who are arriving to sit in alongside of us as we do our presentation. And so want to acknowledge Michelle and Marma Elliott. They were the bereaved whānau voices who actually turned to Tariana and Boru to town and basically said that we as kaupapa providers, as services, we weren't listening to whānau. We couldn't even hear the whānau. And we were so tied up in our own contracting circles, taking care of ticking our own boxes, that we couldn't even hear the whānau. And so this kaupapa is a dedication to those many hands that shifted the silence, that were brave and coming forward and challenging us as kaupapa providers, as clinicians, and to all the whānau bereaved to suicide, who in their loss still come alongside of us and supported us through this mahi. The research, my PhD, was really driven by the request of our bereaved whānau. So the bereaved whānau made it very clear that they didn't want somebody else writing the story, and that it was important that we told our own story. And so I want to acknowledge all of our bereaved whānau who had the confidence in me to bring the story forward. It's a PhD that's been written using our own kupu, our own kōrero, so anybody can pick it up and read it and make sense of it and understand. And in the hope that you can find some solutions, because the belief of this kaupapa is the solutions lie with whānau, in particular for whānau Māori around suicide prevention and postvention. So kia ora,
Kia ora. I have my whānau join me this morning. I asked my mother, Waiomata Johnson, and my sister Jacqueline Johnson to join us and just sit in as a support for Peter and I and the rest of the whānau. So kia ora. Through a whānau lens, how did we mobilise a lot of the initiatives that came from our whānau, our rangatahi and our community itself? Is during the suicides, we had a significant amount of suicides that happened, and that did reduce over time from 2011 to now. But it was around us being able to have the discussions with our whānau and from our whānau, and then voicing those concerns and rari that was happening for them to people, for the likes of Peter, Chris, Marjorie Banks, who was important, and as well as Kapua to guide us through how we would deal with the issues, the many issues that were happening, but more so what was happening in our backyards, let alone anyone else's. We had education that was happening, some raru there or some issues throughout our community. Around then we had a big merger happen. We had a few schools closed down, and that didn't look very promising in terms of how our education was going to be structured, who was going to do what. It was just all up in the air. We were panicking, a community in panic. With the suicides, the education merging that was happening, the politics around that particular education merge, and it was quite unsettling for us. Were our kids going to sit in that phase of not doing anything or not learning anything while the community looks at keeping our schools closed? But we knew it was going to close anyway, with or without that consultation. So it happened, the mergers happened, and we had a whole lot of issues. Some were around the meth. We know that meth is quite rampant in our community, and some of our own whānaus use as well. And it was actually getting their voice and what our whānaus were looking for in terms of how we could support them. What came out of it was a lot of programs, 101 programs, where we were able to provide the program by linking with all our networks, asking them to come to the table. Can we provide these programs to our whānau? And just being real, can you or can't you? If not, then we don't want you sitting at the table. We want people who can do the mahi and help us through that time. So we had the Mental Health 101 who came in and educated our whānau around what mental health looks like for our whānau, what are the signs and symptoms to pick up on, and where to go to if those signs and symptoms came up for them. And even just having someone to go to talk. We had the police come to the table. We also had Paul Bennett, who talks about his journey through walking with the tariwha and a lot of the lived experiences he had as a user and his journey through that. We had pulled together the youth styles, acknowledgement to Sela Kingi, who was a big driver in that kaupapa. She went out to ask and look for our rangatahi. She looked, and she talks about this, she looked at all the students that were doing well in school, but those students actually gave names in terms of who Sela should be going to talk to. So she did, and she brought them all to the table with ourselves and just talked about having a rangatahi voice, and more importantly, being listened to and finding some solutions from them, not us from them. So it was an awesome kaupapa. We had whānau from Wairarapa who brought their rangatahi up and also talked about their kōrero and their journey and initiatives they were doing back home. So we had the Rangatahi Advisory Group, who was a group of our local rangatahi from different rohe, talk to us about what is it they see and what is it that they'd like to do for our rangatahi in Kawerau. We had a lot of issues like a homicide, I believe, around that time, and again, calling it's for us, it was a hui. In clinical terms, it was called a sentinel event, which we weren't used to. So it was bringing our community together, rangatahi whānau, and just talking to them around if there was any of our rangatahi impacted by these particular events, to bring them in. And because we knew that our rangatahi weren't going to specialists or kaimahi, they were actually going to their friends or their cousins and so forth. So it was actually tooling them up, how to support them into the organisation or services to provide that wraparound support. So it was really good. We know that a lot of domestic violence happens, alcohol, drug use within our community. It's a matter of how is it that we connect with our whānau to support them. So kia ora.
At the time, we had a strong blame culture going on in our community where no one really wanted to take responsibility for what was happening in the community for fear of being blamed. And so we had to address the blame culture. And we had a number of different services and providers as a consequence of the blame culture ducking for cover. And in the end, whānau weren't receiving any services or any supports that they really needed. We also had a culture of kaupapa providers and providers operating in silos. And so some of the initiatives that Kelly talked about, in terms of bringing the police to the table, we developed a forum called the Kawerau Immediate Response Team Forum. What that meant was at the front end when the police would respond to incidences or situations specifically around mental health and or addictions and or suicide concerns, that we was as a hauora, as a breed support rōpū, we're sitting at the front end alongside of the police, supporting them in terms of engaging and connecting with the whānau at the time of the incident, rather than waiting 2 weeks later for the information to come. And then when we turn up, whānau go, oh, well, that happened 2 weeks ago. The other core forum was the core clinical forum. Because of the ducking for cover, because of the blame culture, because of the gatekeeping, the core clinical forum was really about bringing us together as providers in terms of truly working alongside of one another and supporting one another in terms of supporting our whānau at the end of the day. I also want to acknowledge Te Rau Matatini at the time, Te Rau Ora, who offered to come into Kawerau at the time, because at the time our whānau didn't want the local hauora, Te Wharetua hauora, to provide the services in terms of whānau-based programs, rangatahi-based programs. They didn't want any of the local community providers. So Te Rau Matatini, Te Rau Ora offered to come into town and created those spaces for our whānau and our rangatahi to design what those programs needed to look like for them and how they would then be delivered. Those programs were key in terms of the solutions and the whānau bringing forward their own stories in terms of what works for them. Kia ora pohe. So part of the strategy in terms of the Kawerau Suicide Prevention Action Plan was that we had a hikoi for life. And so the hikoi for life was really around calling our local community, our people, our whānau, to come and acknowledge those whom we had lost, but more importantly, bringing us together as a community and bringing us together as a whānau to shift the silence. So we had been a community that was silenced as a result of us as providers not collaborating or not hearing our whānau. We also had a launch that acknowledged all of the community providers that step forward, that come up, our rangatahi, our kura, our mokopuna, in terms of breaking that silence, in terms of addressing the suicides within our community. So the Whānau Champion kaupapa is a kaupapa that acknowledges the kōrero. When we first started, we needed to find out what was going on in our community, and as we met with community groups, education groups, rangatahi whānau, it was really clear that our whānau had lost confidence in and the providers and the communities, because they weren't being heard despite the cries that they were echoing over a number of years. And it acknowledges that the message that come through really clearly from our whānau, from our rangatahi, is that they weren't seeking out the supportive services because it was easier for them to go to whānau. They were going to aunties and uncles and mates, and so that's how the whānau champion kaupapa come about. It was actually acknowledging that our whānau were going to whānau, and that's what was working for them. And so the whānau champion is about acknowledging our go-to people and whānau taking care of whānau. So one of the questions we ask is, when things are not okay, who are your whānau going to? And that starts with, we ask ourselves that question. So I had to ask myself, who were my tamariki going to? Who were the ones that I loved the most? Who were they going to when they were not okay? So when they weren't okay, and I could see that if I wasn't their go-to person for them, I would then know who to go to in terms of getting that support for my tamariki, in terms of knowing who their go-to people were. And that's what the whānau champion kaupapa is about, and how we mobilised that strategy, that tool, in terms of identifying who all our whānau champions were within our community, within our sports groups, within our kura, and more importantly within our whānau. And our role was to wrap around and resource those whānau, whatever we needed to do, so that those whānau could take care of their own whānau. And it worked for us in our community, and it worked for our whānau. And my PhD brings forward 10 bereaved whānau and those stories in terms of how those solutions that they have leveraged from as a whānau have supported them to today, and to navigate through that loss.
So when Peter came along, she helped us in terms of providing us with frameworks. One framework that works really well for us is the Pounamu model, which is a framework that guided us through our issues. So for us to be in a place to help our own whānau, we had to deal with some of the issues that we had. So when we told, helped others, we weren't getting caught up, our stuff getting caught up in their kōrero. So what we done was, it was a struggle, and a big struggle for us. We're a whānau that doesn't like to be in the limelight or in the front, we'd rather be in the back doing dishes, like, you know, at the marae or something like that. But it was a struggle because we're a third generation gang whānau, and we don't just put it out there to whakahihi anyone else or ourselves. It was just realising that that's what we were amongst. I mean, with that, we had a different way of communicating with each other. I remember telling Peter, you know, Peter, we'll just have a beer, and that's when the kōrero actually comes out, the real talk. We'll backstab each other, we'll talk about each other, but that was the only time we actually got to kōrero to each other. Before we done all this, what whānau champion looked like. And there was a lot of violence, there was a lot of drugs, there was a lot of alcohol, and a whole lot of issues that were happening for us, and that's where that was our way of communicating. And then when we woke up the next day, you know, although we might have had a fight or what have you at the party, we just sort of held it in and then went on our ways. It wasn't until the next party, oh yeah, bring it up again. But we knew that wasn't good for us, because it just made things a lot more worse for us. And then we got to go through the Pounamu model and talk to a lot of our issues properly and in a positive way. So I got to do my Pounamu first of all with my mother. Oh my gosh, although I knew what happened in our lives, I needed to hear it from my mother's kōrero, not my own, and how she felt during that time. So a lot of interviews happen, and she's like, oh, I don't want to do this interview. I said, well, Mum, it's about us healing ourselves together, not individually, and then growing our kids into better leaders. That's how I saw. I didn't see it then. I tried to hide away, and Peter's going, yeah, but you're a local expert. I didn't understand what those terms were until now. And I'm thinking, I see myself as a whānau champion now more than I did before. So we got to talk about our issues quite good, actually, to the point now we're laughing and it doesn't involve a bottle. And, we can get past those issues and we can talk through them and put in solutions for us. Just, changing that environment. For example, Christmas was always a time we were, all prepared to drink while the kids were, somewhere else. Now it's about just getting together as whānau, just being together, valuing each other's time and the kōrero that we have, because unfortunately a lot of our kōrero from our dad who's passed on was always through drinking. That was the only time he'll talk, pretty much. Well, actually tell us the truth. And it was quite hard for us because had we done this maybe 20 years ago, we would have got more lived experience of his time. But we ended up getting some of it, a real snippet of it, through our how we would share our journey and how we would share it nationwide and even internationally. So we got to share our kōrero, and we had interviews from my father, who was a gang member at the time, and my mum, who talks about her life as a gang mother, and myself, my sister and my brother is growing up in the gang and all the issues that came with that. But now we're a whānau, still have a lot of mahi to do, but we have progressed from then to now in terms of, okay, we need to deal with this, and we also carry that out through our whānau who either PM us or other mediums, just say, hey, I need this, or this is happening to me, and then we talk as a whānau, oh, well, how can we help this whānau? Oh, well, hara mai kōrero, let's have a hui and let's lay it all out on the table. Let's have the real talk. We've got our whānau that have so much frustration. Their kōrero is something we're privileged to be a part of, because not many can open up around their journeys and the things that have happened, especially around sexual abuse, physical abuse, and the many issues or things that they haven't dealt with. So we're in the position of privilege in hearing their stories and being able to help our whānaus. Yeah. Kia ora.
Kia ora puhi. So I just want to acknowledge Jax. So Jackie is one of our whānau who, one of our bereaved whānau. So we all grieve whānau to suicide. We've lost loved ones to suicide. And the whole whānau champion kaupapa really drives that the solutions sit with the whānau. And so I guess in terms of the PhD, one of the questions that I'm asking myself all the time in terms of still being in the sector is how are we designing pathways to support whānau to take care of whānau? So to a degree shifting whānau ora to another level. So Jackie's one of our whānau champions. She's a tuahine to Kelly, and Jackie was one of the ones that we had the privilege to to support, to navigate through her story, to help her find the solutions, to then tell her own story, and is now taking care of her own whānau. So kia ora, Jackie.
Kia ora.
Do you want to look about your Waitanatu website? Just a snapshot.
My journey to the Whoopsie was to actually take our kōrero that's happened within my own family and with the rangatau in our community across to speak on behalf of them, to actually get the word out there of how and what was going on here in Kawerau, purely because I walked that talk when I was younger and was still walking it and still walking it today. So it was just wrapped around uplifting the silence and having, so the kōrero we took over there was the third generation Mogomo whānau working with the rangatai to uplift the suicide that was happening. And in saying that, it was just having to do whatever I could to help our young teenagers that were going through it today and then.
What was it like for you going to Hawaii?
Oh yeah, true. Yeah, so I was chosen out of probably about 15 people to go over to Hawaii where the World Whoopsie Conference, Indigenous Conference was held. And for me personally, I didn't want to go, but because I had never flown on a plane, I'd never left Kawerau, I'd never left my parents, I was still stuck to that nest. But I went because I knew I needed to go, and I was ready to actually share my story or what I walked in the suicide attempts, the 3 suicide attempts I made, being pregnant at a young age. So I had my first son when I was 15, that died, and then I had my second son when I was 16, and he died too. So I was taking all that kōrero over there, and I was ready to present and let them know what had happened and what I had experienced, and to have come from that dark place back into the light again. And it's just sharing that to guide our young ones that it can be done and you can be healed, but it's just finding out that way of how to do it. And I thought being at that conference, sharing my story would get out global, and hopefully it touched some. But I know it did touch some because I had some clean feedback from a lot of different cultures. Was approached by 5 Aboriginal little girls who were so overwhelmed by what I was talking about. So that just showed me that my kōrero that I said was getting out there. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Kiri, ko tātou tēnei, ko mutu tēnei tā.
Hai rā. He mihi kawana tēnei kia koutou mō ngā kōrero whakahirahira. Oh, can you hear me?
Ai.
Okay, ka pai. We have time for some pātai, some feedback. It's a stunning achievement, and this model of practice could be taken up by every community around Aotearoa. And I hope that that you will have a hand in leading the rollout of this program across communities. When we did some mahi over in Australia with the storytelling program that was from one community going and visiting another community and telling their stories about how they addressed suicide, how they addressed or were working hard to respond to suicide, drug abuse and other lateral violence, whānau violence in their communities. My question for you before I open up to everybody else who has questions and comments, because we have quite a few participants in this session, is how do you share your successes with other communities? Kai rotoi, in Aotearoa.
So at the time we were doing the mahi kiri and, doing what needed to be done for our own community and our own whānau on the first instance, we also undertook a roadshow across Damutu with Te Kupuna, our bereaved whānau to suicide. And we did the best that we could on the smell of an oily rat, really. So I just want to acknowledge, the Ministry of Health, Chaz McCarthy and Mariah Johns, who, it wasn't a lot, but it helped because we really had nothing. So we relied heavily on the support of other communities, universities, learning institutions to fund us to get there. And the complication was always, they only wanted one person. But for us, it was about, well, actually, if you want the kaupapa, there's, at least 10 of us that are coming that need to be there because we are the story. And so that was the first thing we done on the first instance. The other one was that it was really mobilised through marae, identifying our whānau champions and getting them to run the wānanga on their own marae, resourcing our rangatahi to mobilise their own whānau champion wānanga. But just want to give the rākau over to the chief over here, who was, Chris Marjoribanks. And I echo it throughout my PhD. We could never have undertaken the movement that we did without his bravery, because we crossed all the boundaries. We challenged the notions that the clinicians were not the experts. It's actually the whānau that were the experts. And he was the one really that took all the hits for us so that we could carry on doing the mahi, but also done a lot of work in terms of managing the ministerial inquiries, and it was unfortunately a lot of training institutions saw it as an opportunity to make a bit of money out of our misery, and so he had to manage all those things. So, kia ora, Chris.
Kia ora koutou, te whānau. E te mi nui ki a koutou, tai mai, ki te whakarongo ki te kōrero o te whānau champions model. Te kaupapa ki te pati te ngangara o whakamōmore. Mi nui ki te whānau hoki o mō rātou kōrero tika, kōrero pono, ki te whakamārama mātou o tēnei e take. Just everybody out there, just a special, I think, whilst Peter has given a lot of acknowledgement, to me it comes back to the whānau voice, the whānau journey, the challenges that they were experiencing and continue to experience out there with the lack of support, the lack of understanding to where to seek support from. Yes, there was a lot of challenge in terms of the structures that were out there that were defensive of how they had been historically engaging with whānau, and their resistance to change that model. Whilst I was a facilitator through those ministries, I have to particularly acknowledge Peter. Peter came to me with a thought and an idea that really challenged the existing system out there. Whānau champions model, which was totally resisted by the clinicians in that space. even the process of our talking about it publicly, the national entity that was responsible for that at the time was CASA. We had a direct challenge from them advising us not to proceed with what we're doing because of the potential of contagion. To be honest, I didn't initially know what that word meant. But from the whānau voice, it was, we have been silent too long. We have held our hurt, our mamai, our losses amongst us as a whānau, and have never had that forum to look at what should be different. And Peter's model, the most simple model, looking at who would you trust, who would you go to in times of challenge, of need of support, and most importantly, how do we support those people, those whānau champions, to uplift with some basic skills, never to be the clinician, and this is where I think the clinicians lost the level of understanding, just to have enough knowledge to be that front-end facilitator and support that person or that whānau on the journey to broader supports. Look, I have the deepest respect of our tikanga, but in many instances, it was looking for karakia to heal the process. It was deep mental issues. It needed more than that. But that whānau champion was just to be that point of engagement. So a series of wānanga will run with Peter around giving them basic skills, what to identify within a whānau member. When they stopped talking, when they went to a quiet space, when there's some of their languaging changed about the risk or low quality of life, how to make sure those people weren't left on the journey on their own or relationship issues as they had been in the past. And, you know, from 13 and 18 months, I think we went 3.5 years post that. And certainly, for me, the actually validation of the whānau champion model is we haven't cured all the social issues. Would be totally wrong to claim that. They are still occurring. But we're seeing when there's suicide ideation, in many of those instances now, they seek support. And that is the change, a change of understanding out there of who to go to for support. And you won't be put in a deep clinical space. It may be if there's deep mental unwellness, which has to be stabilized. But a lot of it is about someone trusted to talk to, supporting the whānau. So, kia ora, I talked a lot, but I just wanted to capture the whole journey and what was important to us in terms of that change. Can I just also acknowledge a couple of chairs, Maria Johns, Tariana Turia. Twice made her journey quietly without political fanfare, nothing. To sit in our whare, what can I do for you? As simple as that. And then step back. So I just want to acknowledge those people forever.
Kia ora. Pohe, can you hear me? Paiana. There's a couple of comments that have come through on the chat, and also some questions. So from Emma to all panelists, tēnā koutou wāhine mā. From Alaska to all panelists, mōrena koutou. From Kirikiriroa team, oh Carl, that's for me. From Kahu McClintock, nā te raura te honore, nei rā te mihi kia koutou ko Peter. From Kirikiriroa team, ngā mihi aroha whānau, Alan Norman, to all panelists, e mihi ana hau kia kōrua mō kōrero tia. Thank you for your courage in sharing your whānau journey. You give all our whānau inspiration and courage to do the same. Thank you, Eho Peter. Congratulations on completing your PhD, Alan Tautoko. From Maria to all panelists, tēnā koutou wāhine toa, just wanted to mihi to you all for your leadership and a commitment to your own whānau and the communities to make a difference. From Nikki Coleman to all panelists, from CASA, I say so sorry we got it wrong, and see how it could have been done so differently. Now we have some pātai. The first one is from Neil Rogers. how did you manage both learning from services and teaching the rangatahi at the same time?
So one of the key issues that we were battling with at the time this was all happening was the entrenched poverty within our community. And so we quickly realised that a lot of our rangatahi didn't have access to Wi-Fi at home, didn't have access to computers at home. There was lots of stuff going on with their parents and their whānau for a whole lot of reasons. And so we created learning spaces, supported learning spaces where we called on whānau, where we called on the community. We supplied computers, a suite of computers, provided access for our rangatahi with teaching support, where our rangatahi, our tamariki, our whānau could come and access those resources in terms of attending to the educational requirements in terms of schooling. We also had wānanga with rangatahi and whānau in terms of what opportunities we needed to be putting in place within our community, and so negotiated with Wairiki Polytechnic at the time to come to town, and our rangatahi actually identified the training that they wanted to do, and at the time they wanted to do beauty and fashion. We needed to put in licensing support, CV support in terms of supporting them to transition from kura into mahi, and so those spaces were created and set up for whānau and led and driven by whānau, and that was one of the strategies that we used in terms of navigating through those needs.
Ngā mihi, he pātai anō, what has helped you sustain your model? This is from Maria.
I think as you see with the likes of Jackie sitting here today, those voices are still out there in the community. Those voices are people that know and trust them. They sit amongst a lot of those challenged whānau. And so the voice, what occurred wasn't contact, it's for that appointment time, in many cases it ends. But when you live amongst your whānau and the wider community, to maintain those relationships on a long-term basis, and people know you're being on that challenging journey, but are still there, people look to you for support. So I think the sustainability of the model is about when it's created in your community by your people who continue to live and be part of the community. I think that's one of the key things of sustainability.
So it's not just for me working as a hauora kaimahi, it's not a 9 to 5 mahi, it continues. I'll talk about some experiences where we'd get whānau who come over at 1 o'clock in the morning, but that was the time for them to share their story. They were ready to, and it's not for you to say, no, go away, it's 1 o'clock in the morning, Carl. It's about, oh, come in, have a cup of tea. You know, manaki them and then make them feel comfortable, and then we talk about the kōrero. And then, you know, the next day we'll mobilise the whānau champion and the supports from the haore and wherever we could get supports from. So, yeah.
So the sustainability is driven by the whānau.
Yeah, kia ora. We have some aroha mai from Alan Norman. How did you include whānau who may be living away from your papakainga?
That's a challenging issue, because what you don't have there is the relationships and the ability to engage, identify that there are challenges with the individuals. But we did have some that were aware of the modelling in Kawerau and made contact for us to go and provide, as Peter said, those wānanga which they headed off and carried out. And that was mainly driven through whānau that lived away, but had heard the story. There were a couple of documentaries done with Kelly and her whānau that really raised that understanding. So I think it was through those promotions that people became aware of it. I know people have a great belief, and you dial in an 0800 number and you talk to the individual. I'm not disrespecting that. It's probably appropriate in many spaces where you have technology or confidence in that type of support. However, we saw that the kanohi ki te kanohi with trusted members in the whānau was the model that was extremely effective for our whānau in Kawerau.
Can I give an experience we had with my niece, Jackie's daughter? So her partner committed suicide, so we had to provide those wraparound supports for her. So she decided to move and live with her partner's whānau. And then a lot of issues would come through via text to my mum. And they weren't very nice texts, but it was a result of her grieving still and the loss of her partner. So as Chris said, kanohi ki te kanohi, we can do things text, phone, but we had to travel over, and it was great that the Hauora resourced us to be able to do that. And it was during work time, and I said, look, Peter, my niece is doing this, this and this to our mother, and we weren't in a space to support her in terms of face-to-face being there, going to see what environment she was in. So without that resourcing and without that support for our whānau, we wouldn't be able to support her as we'd like to be there. So we were able to travel there and actually sit down with her and the whānau there and just say, you know, what's going on, and have that real talk. So, yeah.
I think there's one little thing to add to that. Never go to a whare on the expectation you're going to get a kai. They might only have a cup of tea. So take the kai with you. Open the door with manaakitanga. And I think we did that in everything we did. Here's a kai. Let's sit down and have it later on.
Peter, how can our whānau access your PhD?
It's you can access it via Te Wharewana o Awanuiarangi. The link's available via there.
Ka pai. There's some comments here. Any more pātai whānau? In the meantime, I'll read these comments from Te Ao Māori. Ngā mihi nui ki a koutou e hoa mā me tō kōrero whakanuitia. Mā te whānau anō I pūpuri ai te whānau. Mā te whānau anō te kaha me te rongoa. Ngā mihi. And another one from Te Ao Māori. Koutou anō hoki e peta me tō rōpu e tūwhera ai I takahi ai te huarahi. Hei tauira mō mātou e whai ake nei kāti.
Kia ora. Tēnā koutou.
He pātai anō. Kia ora whānau, this is from Susie. Kia ora whānau, thank you for sharing and letting us know how we can do things differently. I love the karanga, the many hands that shifted the silence. Ngā mihi whānau, Susie Taylor, your neighbour in Rotorua. I go up. Ko tērā te kōrero, te katoa te kōrero. Well, he mihi anō tēnei ki a koutou ngā whānau. This has been so important, so valuable. Just really want to acknowledge your aroha and your love for your whānau, your love for your community, the time that you've put in without payment, without recognition, and just say you are walking, living exemplars of that, the old whakaaro that the revolution begins at home. So it matters what we do in our own backyards. It matters what we do within our four walls, and just absolutely honour and respect and acknowledge your years of hard mahi. Okay, here's some more pātai from Renee Wilson. Can you please explain to us what the Pounamu model entails?
So the Pounamu for us was unpacking our lives amongst us all. So I was able to do the Pounamu on my whānau. Not all of them, I must say, I wasn't able to do all our Pounamu because I felt it best placed for peta. In some instances, like for my sister, Jacqueline, I felt that it would be best for peta to do her Pounamu.